But at the moment, it is my huge pleasure to welcome Hussein Aboubakr Mansour, who was born in 1989 in Cairo. He received a conservative Muslim education, grew up religiously devout, originally wanting to become a jihadist. While witnessing the creeping radicalization of society, he developed his own personal beliefs, pursuing with strength and determination the right to live freely. He participated in the Arab Spring protests in 2011 and soon afterwards sought political asylum in the United States, which he was granted in 2014. He since served as an assistant professor of Hebrew language at the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, California. He became a United States citizen in 2017, served in the U.S. Army Reserve, and is currently a public speaker, a blogger, and an advocate for peace and education. It's a wonderful pleasure to welcome Hussein to us this evening. Hussein, are you there?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me, Rabbi Lawrence.
Right. So I hope you have had the opportunity to watch the Minority of One video. And that, if you haven't watched it yet, spoiler alert, he starts life as an Egyptian, becomes radicalized, and then defects to the side of good. But I'm not going to talk you all the way through the video now because there's still the opportunity to watch that. And you've got the link and you should be able to download it, and it's still available through till the beginning of next week. Hussein, tell us a little bit about your background in Egypt. How do you grow up? What's your family like?
Thank you. If you had watched the movie or read the book, you probably have a pretty good idea. I grew up in an average conservative middle-class family, which is pretty much all family, most families in the Middle East. My father was a banker. My mother, as an observant Muslim woman, she stayed home to raise the kids and feed them well. I grew up with 3 siblings. I was the second in order, and I received my education from schools, from the mosques, from the culture in general, and there was absolutely nothing extraordinary about my childhood at all. Of course, most of my childhood was in the 1990s. That was kind of the when I remember it in Egypt, it was a very, very different time. There was some feeling of stability, that the Middle East in general was more stable, of course, than it is today. But that stability was hiding so much tension that was building up that I observed when I was a child. And they talked about it in the book, and you mentioned it now, which is a creeping radicalization. And everybody was becoming religious at the beginning of the 1990s. I remember very clearly, my mom went out of the house with her hair uncovered many times. A lot of women in my family had their hair uncovered. And by the end of the 90s, by the beginning of the 2000s, there was not a single woman left in our family that were not covering her hair. And that is just representative, and I insist on this, of something that happened to the wider population in Egypt, and I would say the entire Muslim world, that there was a rising wave of religiosity. And even the word religiosity is deceiving here, because it's not any kind of religiosity. It's a very specific kind of conservative religiosity that has a political program behind it. And those were the circumstances that I grew up in. It was just this tension building up till, of course, finally it exploded in the Arab Spring at 2011.
Right. You've got 3 brothers and 1 sister. And you talk about quite a sort of patriarchal environment in your family, and your oldest brother being groomed to be the leader. And eventually, I think he becomes an imam.
He does, yeah.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about the relationship with your family and where you were in the pecking order.
So yeah, I as I said, I was born the second child. My older brother, Muhammad, of course, the most popular male name on the planet. He was the first child. He was the firstborn, and of course, I dodged the bullet of the name Muhammad by being born the second, because one has to take it, Muhammad is the most popular name. You enter, I remember in my school, for example, you enter the classroom and you say, "Where's Muhammad?" And it's just like half of the class stands up. And then you're like, "Okay, sit down. Where's Ahmad?" And then a quarter of the class stands up. And then there is a small quarter that has diverse names of, oh, Hussein, Ali, Mansoor, all of this. So this, and I think this is also another representation of just a very deeply collectivist culture, where every male is supposed to be a certain prototype or try to spend his life conforming to a certain prototype, and same thing for females. I was the second. My brother got all of the honor. You know, he's the eldest. Is Muhammad. He was also the first son to be born to my father's generation. So my father also comes from a big family. He had about 5 brothers and 1 sister. And Muhammad, my older brother, was the first child in that 3rd generation. So he was celebrated also by the wider family in general. And I loved Muhammad. I loved my parents, but many times I felt that I was overshadowed completely by their just excitement and admiration for him. And I think that was a very first seed of personal alienation that I felt, or just lack of attention, and me trying to become competitive at everything I do, to be better and to deserve people's love and admiration the way my older brother does. So when my mom tried to feed us, I was the best eater. When we had to go to school, I was the best student. And when we had to go to mosque, I was the best person praying. And if I heard the imam saying that we have to hate Jews or Americans, I'll be the best hater. I was just trying to be competitive in everything I do in order to tell people that, I'm good, love me. And ironically, that kind of led me in a different way, in a different direction in life.
Right. So before you sort of turned your back on everything the family held dear, you were actually craving approval in everything you did. Just talk about, how did women fit into society in sort of that patriarchy?
The position of women is actually it's very complicated. It's and I have to warn people that there are always caricatures that are very, very, they poorly represent actual reality. So the image that Middle Eastern Muslim women have absolutely no power and completely subjugated is not entirely accurate. And the other image by the, apologists that there are no problem whatsoever and women are completely free and they wear the hijab because they want to, is absolutely not true either. And reality, as it is with human beings, is much more complicated. And I want to give an example with the issue of hijab, the head covering. It is absolutely true that a lot of Muslim women will wear it willingly. But here, willingly might be a misrepresentation or an inaccurate or not entirely expressive, because there is a whole network of pressure, moral pressure, peer pressure, social pressure, sexual pressure determined to make them want to wear it, or to make them wear it. So they wear it willingly, yes, but actually, if we speak about the alternative of not wearing it, it's very, very unpleasant. So that is basically the situation of women, that they are pressured into accepting certain positions in society. They can't, for example, my grandmother owned the building, the block building in which we lived, really, and she rented out apartments and shops at the building. So that's a quite, I would say, a privileged position for a woman. She owns property, she manages her own finances. But my same grandmother insisted on taking my mother out of school when she was 18 and forcing her into a marriage that my mom didn't want, to my father. And here you can see how is this a very complicated situation, where women do have some powers in certain areas, but they do lack a lot of powers in other areas. And by the end of the day, the sexual function in which they perform continues to be held as the number one function that they must perform before anything else. So as I said, it's a very it's not a straightforward answer. It's very complex, but definitely the situation of women in Western countries is superior on so many metrics to the situation in women in Middle Eastern country. But as I said, the situation in Middle Eastern countries is complicated. It's not that they don't have power in everything or that they have power in everything.
So how's it your grandmother came to own the block?
It's actually it was gifted to her by her former husband. That's how she didn't work, and she didn't. That's the thing. She didn't. The opportunity of a woman to engage in the market in order to accumulate assets, such as the building block, is also very, very limited. But still, she would be able to own those assets if she acquired him by having her primarily reproductive function, which is being a wife. And that's exactly, I think that is at the heart of a lot of the tension in Muslim countries around the issue of women. It's just the insistence on containing women in their reproductive function specifically.
Right. Identity is a really important motif in everything that you write about. And you are exposed right at the beginning of your book. I mean, people let me recommend Hussein's book, Minority of One. It's the same title as the film. It's easy. It's written by the same author. It has his picture on the front, which is him in a blue shirt, just like he looks now. And it has a lot more texture and depth. And it's good reading. So don't just end with with having watched the film and this discussion. It's worth reading the book. You talk about the tensions in identity in Egypt. It has a proud history of its own. It is seen as part of the Arab world. It is part of the Islamic world. And these different identities are constantly in conflict. Just to explain what it means to grow up in that kind of world.
It's not, again, anything about the Middle East is never a straightforward answer. And the issue of identity, despite its complete primacy in Middle Eastern affairs, whether geopolitical, even internal in every single country, is not an easy answer, and especially not in a country like Egypt. Egyptians have almost a three-dimensional identity structure. So they are Egyptian. It's one of the most ancient civilizations in the world, and it predates by just millennia Arab and Islamic civilization. Egyptians are very aware of that. And then they are a part of the Islamic civilization. And then recently they became a part of the Arab world. And the Arab world is the most recent analytical category. I just would like to remind everybody that Arab as an analytical category of identity that has a political meaning did not really exist prior to the 19th century. This is a very modern thing to say the Arab world or Arab civilization or so on. But Egypt, of course, as one of the centers that harbored and fostered Arab nationalism, had this Arab consciousness deeply rooted in its culture. So the identity of Egyptians is actually a very, very convoluted issue. The name of the republic itself, the official name of Egypt, is the Arab Republic of Egypt, Jumhuriyat Misr al-Arabiya. And the name of Egypt, as I said, which predated Arabic by millennia, or modern Arabic by millennia, is Misr. And if you know Hebrew, it's very close to Mitzrayim. But that word in itself is Arabic. It's not Egyptian. The word for Egyptian is actually Egypt, or from which the word Coptic comes. So here you have Egyptians expressing their identity that is not Arab in Arab terms. And that should kind of maybe give you a little bit of how complicated for Egyptians to think about who they are. And the way that Egyptians act within that paradigm is that it's very fluid. So an Egyptian in rivalry with neighboring Arab states, Egyptians will say, well, we're not really Arab, we're better than Arabs, we're predate Arabs, we're Egyptians. And then if they are standing, for example, or seeing themselves juxtaposed to the West or Israelis, they will view themselves as Arabs And of course, if they are more religious, they primarily view themselves as Muslims. So the way that a person interacts with that paradigm or three-dimensional structure of identity will depend first on the situation, and secondly, on the personal inclination of the individual. If the person is religious or has sympathies towards political Islam specifically, or Islamism, then definitely the categories of Egyptian and Arab will mean nothing, and they will completely focus on themselves being Muslim. But that is very complicated for everybody, because even if you were not an Islamist, you're still a pious conservative Muslim, and you love Islam. So you see yourself Arab and Egyptian and Muslim, and you don't know how to sort that together.
Right. There's one group or a grouping that plays a big part in your story, and occasionally we hear about them on the news. But a very significant and historic part of the Egyptian community is the Coptic community and the Coptic Christians. Who are they?
So the word Copt, as I said, that's actually originally, that's the word for Egyptian. Coptic, it's very similar in its root, as you see, to the English word Egypt, Copt. They are the indigenous community of Egypt, members of the Coptic Orthodox Church. So they are Christian. It's an ethnic Orthodox church. So it's both a denomination, a Christian Orthodox denomination, and also a cultural ethnic complex, an ethno-cultural complex that contains the remnant of the indigenous culture of Egypt prior to the Arabization of the country in the 8th century BC. The Copts are actually the largest Christian minority, not just in the entire Middle East, but in the entire Muslim world. They are the largest non-Muslim group living in any Muslim country. And that makes them extremely, extremely significant politically to the Egyptian Republic and to Egypt. We know that the Middle East is a place that's rife with sectarian violence and ethnic conflict. Yet Copts, I would say, they are one of the most benign and one of the most peaceful minorities in the Middle East. It's unbelievable. I mean, they tolerate a lot of discrimination from the state, a lot of bigotry that is unfortunately present heavily in the mainstream Muslim culture in Egypt. They tolerate everything, and they will always prefer the stability of the state over chaos or instability, which is also a lesson I think that Jews know very well, because many times chaos brings much more malevolence and just violence on a minority than a discriminatory state does. And I think that's how the Copts understand it, that even if the Egyptian state is discriminatory, it's still preferable to anarchy or chaos. It's a huge community. They think they have also now huge migrant communities in the UK, North America, Australia, and they are, as I said, they are very peaceful, and the way they view their identity is also very interesting. They think of themselves as Arabized. They know they are not original Arabs, but they do accept Arab identity as the cultural context in which they live. But they hold deeply to their Coptic Egyptian identity, and they really don't see any conflict between that identity and the identity of the majority of the Muslims. And that's a very interesting, I think it's one of the most interesting minority situations in the Middle East. As I said, they do suffer from heavy discrimination from the state, a lot of bigotry from the population. They are the favorite targets of Islamic terrorists in Egypt. Absolutely the favorite targets. Whenever there's a war between the state and Islamic terrorists, they actually attack Copts because they have no sympathy in the population. They heard the global image of the state and so on. But they are a great community, and they helped me a great deal. And I definitely wouldn't have been here today if it wasn't for absolutely marvelous support in helping me in Egypt and then helping me to get out of Egypt.
Right. You talk about your uncle Magdi playing a game of chess with you, or introducing you to the game of chess, just as we're looking at sort of Christian attitudes to Christianity.
So chessboard. So First of all, chess is actually a Middle Eastern game. It's a Persian game in origin. It's originated in the Middle East, but of course, after the rise of Western modernity, even just the design of the chess set globally has been determined by the modern Western design, and that's how, if in the Middle East they buy chess sets, they come of course from China. They are built onto that design, and in that design, the king has, of course, a cross on top. So I don't remember how old, maybe I was 8 or 9, and I was sitting at home, and my uncle Magdi wanted to teach me how to play chess. So he went and bought a chess board, and then he came, and then he opened the chess pieces, and then the first thing that he did is that he took the king chess piece, and he broke the cross with his teeth. And he told me every time you get a chess board, you have to do this because this is a cross, and we're Muslims, and the cross is a sign of the infidels. And that's a representative, unfortunately, of a lot of the way that in populist religion, or the most populist strata of Islamic belief, a lot of Muslims view the relationship to Christianity, which is a medieval way. Back 1,000 years ago, the world, as you know, was divided. Our part of the world was divided into the Christian Europe or Islamic Middle East, and both of them had this, global competition of global domination over people. And that attitude, that medieval attitude, unfortunately survived in modern Islamic teachings, and it goes to a lot of simple Muslims or they get taught that this competition still exists. Now, if you understand anything about the modern world, you know that this competition doesn't exist anymore because the West has stopped identifying itself as Christian very long time ago. But that's not how many people, like my uncle, understands the world. They are still stuck in that medieval imagery of like the lands of Islam, has a global war against the lands of the Christianity.
Right. So this isn't just coming out of state offices. This is what people really feel in their heart and how they live their lives.
A lot of people, yeah.
And so how do these attitudes get channeled in school? Tell me about education and programming of identity.
So definitely in schools. So you have the government curriculum, the government written curricula for schools in Egypt mostly is not too bad. There are bad instances in it, especially history lessons about Israel are quite bad. Some of the stories that are chosen from early Islamic literature are definitely bad, but I think that part is just done unintentionally. But most of the bad content and the indoctrination just comes from the volunteering of the teacher, thinking he's doing a good job, he's raising the next generation of Egyptians, so he has to just tell them all the good things, or that all the truths that he knows about the world, that the Jews are bad, that America or the Christians are still conspiring against us and lying, and they are conspiring with the Jews against us. In the religion lessons, one of the worst things that happen is that there are religion and Quran classes, and in those classes, before the class starts, the minority Christian students will get up and leave, and they are told to go maybe play in the, play outside while the religion classes. And this is viewed as tolerance. This is, of course, viewed as religious tolerance because they are Christian children. We're not making them sit through the Quran class. But this shows, like, if you're a child, as you know, children don't really understand identity quite yet. They don't know what Muslim and Christian and Jew or this means. But you start to understand that there's something different, that those few kids have to get out, that you're sitting inside and you're playing outside. Of course, at the beginning, you feel jealous because you wish to play outside with them. But then you start understanding that that it's because they are not Muslim. You're the one who has the grace of being Muslim. And then that same teacher will probably say a lot of bad things about Christianity that keeps deepening that division that is growing in your mind between yourself and that Christian child.
So Tachlis, what do they say about Christians? And what did they say about Jews?
They're filthy. Different attitudes. So Jews are it's much more psychotic, I would say. So that Jews are not really human. It's not that Christians are misguided. They believe in a false faith. They believe in false information. They have false stories. They are pagans. They worship three gods. They worship like the person of Christ. That's what they say. So they're just, and they are greedy and they are unclean because they don't have the cleanliness of Islam and so on. So that's what you would hear about Christians. About Jews, as I said, it's much more psychotic. It's not, Jews know the truth, but they choose to be against the truth. It's almost a story of the fallen angel, kind of. Is that Jews know that Islam is right, but because they hate Allah and they hate Muslims and they hate God, they decide to actively fight Islam. They want to destroy the morality. They want to destroy the world. And then there are a lot, as I said, there's a lot of psychotic imagery that ends up being weaved into your consciousness. It's almost that Jews become the representation of a primordial evil, or evil in its most pure sense. And then in colloquial Arabic in Egypt and many other countries, the word Jew doesn't even refer to a person anymore. Like people would use it as a curse, or use it to describe something that's ununderstandable and incomprehensible evils, like what a Jew that man is. And that means that man is so evil. And that unfortunately just became part of the cultural fabric. I mean, I read Arabic novels and the word Jew will be used in it in that way, and becomes part of almost an unconscious reality. I remember a Lebanese friend who told me the story in Lebanon. So, when you hit your leg when you're walking around the house and you're like, oh, dang it. Oh, so my Lebanese friend told me that his father, every time he dropped something like this happened, he used to say, Allah yal'an Abul Yahud. May God curse the Jews. May God curse the Jews. And that was just random. And then they migrated to America and his son grew up here. And when his son was 18, he's starting to understand the world differently and realized this is really bad. And then one time his father did it, and then he asked him in English, and I think that's very important that it was in English. And he told him, Dad, did you just say, may God curse the father of the Jews? And then his dad thought about it for a moment and said, oh my God, you're right. That's what I've been saying, but I've never thought about it. So it becomes almost an unconscious part of the culture itself.
It's taught in school. You showed in the film some children's cartoons and romantic stories, and various times where the Jews are portrayed very negatively. One of the films that you showed, the Jews just look European Jewish. There was no Zion or anything Israeli about it. Is a distinction made between Jews and Israelis in this assault on Jews?
In a very, very, very few people do, but the vast majority of people don't have any clear distinction in mind between Zionist, Jewish, and Israeli. And first of all, I have to talk about the culture itself. The way that I explained, for example, Egyptian identity and how complex and interlocked everything is, and it's almost impossible to try to separate those elements from each other. I would say this is the construct of Islamic and Arab culture in general, that people are not able to make distinctions about different categories, even about their own selves. So they do that about Israelis and Jews and Zionists as well. There is absolutely no distinction. For a lot of people, they mean one and the same thing. One thing. So every Israeli is a Jew, is a Zionist. Every Jew is a Zionist, is an Israeli, and that's how they view the world. Very few people unsuccessfully try to make the distinctions.
So here, particularly on campus or in the debate we had over Labour Party anti-Semitism, people tried to draw a nuanced distinction between attacks on Israel or attacks
Right.
on Zionism as a colonial or apartheid identity, and saying that's not anti-Semitism. The backstory where you grew up made no such distinctions.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Actually, there was a court ruling from Egypt 2 weeks ago. There was a Jewish shrine. It's called the Abu Khatira Shrine, somewhere in the Delta. He's a famous Moroccan rabbi. There are a lot of Jews that believe that he had mystical powers, and so on. A few thousand Jews go visit his shrine every year in Egypt, and then the government was sued in order to be forced to stop this, that no Jews should visit. And then the highest administrative court in Egypt just ruled 2 weeks ago, or prohibited that Jewish festival from happening. And this was celebrated by the Egyptian media. And the reason that this was celebrated is that they make that no distinction. They believe Jewish means Zionist, means Israeli. The fact that they stopped Jewish believers from praying at a Jewish shrine, it's a strike against the Israeli enemy, and that's how they think about those matters. There is no distinction. The same way that it's still very difficult to make a distinction, for example, between what is Arab and what's Islamic.
In your early teens, the planes fly into the World Trade Center, and that transforms your understanding of the world, and there's a resurgence of Islamic pride and Arabic pride that comes through that. When I was exactly the same age, Sadat made peace with Menachem Begin. And I remember that as a very defining point and an opportunity for hope. You were growing up in a world until then where technically Egypt was at peace with Israel. How were they able to reconcile this peace with Israel, which was such a big deal? And Sadat had come over to Israel. I mean, Sadat ended up being assassinated, I know, but how was the country able to reconcile the fact of the peace treaty with all this prejudice that is being spewed into your upbringing?
Well, this is also very complicated. It's actually one issue that I wish to write about it. When I want to write actually a book about the history of modern Egypt to try to explain a lot of those complexities that a lot of people can't understand. So it seems that Sadat did wish to have an actual solid peace with Israel. If we go back to what was written in the Egyptian media at the time, the Egyptian TV, we'll find that the Egyptian state did try to promote actual sentiments of peace and normalization, and now we're going to become friends with the Israelis. Two things changed that direction completely: the Islamic Revolution of Iran and the assassination of President Sadat, and they are not both unrelated. They are actually very, very related. So when the Islamic Revolution happened in 1979, fears intensified all over the Middle East, from the Arabian or the Persian Gulf to the Atlantic, that this Islamic revolution is going to start happening in all other Muslim countries. That was a very legitimate fear at the time. There was also an attempted coup in Saudi Arabia. I don't know how many people know about this, but a rebel group actually did occupy the Holy Mosque in Mecca, the holy site in Islam. It was a very terrifying time for a lot of Muslim countries who feared that Iran is going to start, which is actually what Iran is doing today, that Iran is going to start exporting its ideology of Islamic revolutionism to the entire region. So that fear existed in Egypt as well. And then when Sadat signed the peace treaty with Israel, and they said the Egyptian state did seem to be inclined to try to promote actual peace, the Islamists in Egypt assassinated President Sadat, and this intensified the fears even more that, oh my God, it's now happening in the most important Arab state. They killed the president. Egypt might see an Islamic revolution. So the Egyptian state, to try to manage the situation, decided to reverse, which I think was a terrible mistake, decided to reverse its plan of action with Israel. They went to Israel and told them, listen, the population doesn't want peace. Let's keep it the cold, formal peace, but we can't normalize the relationships. And the Egyptian state decided to freeze all the plans that they did actually have plans for cultural exchange and so forth. And that actually made the situation worse because it actually empowered, and I think it's a mistake because the Egyptian state thought it would be managing the situation, but it only empowered the Islamic polemic or the Islamist polemic against the state itself. And one of the unfortunate things also that the state did is that it rationalized to the population the peace treaty that it's just temporary. It's just a temporary truce. The Egyptian state is actually guilty of this. I doubt that the leadership of the state actually believed in this, but I think they thought that this is a good strategy to kind of calm the anti-Israel sentiment, is to tell people this is only a temporary truce till we, amass the necessary power, and then we can fight Israel. So what this did is it only it kept the anti-Semitism, it kept the hostility towards Israel, it empowered Islamist anti-Semitic voices, and it just created the centrifuge of even more and more anti-Semitism. I would say that the culture I grew up in is much more anti-Semitic than the culture my father grew up in. And my father grew up at the time when Israel and Egypt did have actual wars.
9/11 happens.
Yeah.
What does it feel like to young teen Hussein?
It was, I can't begin to describe it. There was an inflammation of sensations all over the country. The mosques were inflamed, the teachers at schools were inflamed. All of a sudden, Islam became the center stage of public, political, cultural, and social life. The war in terror started, war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, and at the same time, the Second Intifada was going. You all remember what the Second Intifada looked like, suicide bombings every other day. So you switch on the TV in the Arab world, and it's like the apocalypse. It's the end of days. The final confrontation between Islam and Jews and Christians is on. Muslims are being killed in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Palestine. So this was definitely used as a mobilization call for my generation. And I got into it. I completely believed it. I believe that we're living through apocalyptic time where Islam is rising back to fight the infidels. I started to go into mosque 5 times a day. And it's not just me. It seems that a lot of people in my generation went through the same experience where 9/11 was actually a radicalizing moment. And I think this is exactly what bin Laden wanted. And if you think about it, it was actually my generation that made ISIS happen, which is even significantly more radical than Al-Qaeda. And that generation were just like me. When 9/11 happened, they were teenagers. And then all of a sudden, Islam became the center of their life at mosque, at school. It's just that they have to serve Islam. So it was definitely a significant and a pivotal moment in the history of the region and the world.
What did it feel like to you?
What it felt like to me? At the beginning, it was confusing. I didn't know, what is this? What's going on? And then my parents were pleased, and my school teacher specifically was very happy. I remember people giving out pamphlets in the school saying that this is a blessing from Allah and the sign of victory. So I felt ecstatic. Then I became, oh my God, okay, this is a great thing. It's beautiful. And I thought it was wonderful. And I started following the news of the suicide bombings coming from the Second Intifada even more closely. And I wanted to become a jihadist. I wanted to be a part of that glory.
So you and your friend Amir start planning these things.
Yeah, we would sit in the class breaks and talk about them. And I remember very clearly, we couldn't have been older than 13 at the time. We were talking about suicide bombings in Israel. And I remember me and him came up with this idea of 2 consecutive bombings that happened at the same place. That basically said, like, if 2 people, like me and you, one of us do it first, and the second person does it when all the police and the ambulance and the rescue forces will come, that will be even better. And I remember us thinking about those things. And it seemed normal. It seemed absolutely normal to think about.
How are you going to get into Israel to do it? Or where were you going to do it?
we didn't. I mean, we thought about. It's really sad to smile talking about this, but now it seems funny. But we talked about stadiums. Oh, but they sure search people going into stadiums. What about restaurants? We were talking about all the potential options. And also there was, of course, the incentive. I mean, it has to do with a lot of things. There's also the whole issue of martyrdom, and then you go to paradise, you go to heaven 100%. You're guaranteed a premium spot in heaven if you die as a martyr. So that's a big incentive as well right there.
I want to just clarify, because I've been involved in a lot of discussions on interfaith panels that, it is as false to suggest that all Islam has one doctrine as it is to suggest that all Christianity has one doctrine, as to suggest that every Jew believes and represents themselves the same way. And so when you talk about following a particular strand, you're not speaking for all Islamic belief. One area that you highlight for its strong and trenchant anti-Semitism and for its piety, if I could use that, its religious fervor, is the sort of the Salafi doctrine.
Yeah, thank you actually for mentioning this. This is actually, I've spent my life trying to understand this, trying to understand myself, where I grew up, what is, what I am, who are us as a people. And I have to say that one of the main problems of Islam in the 19th, 20th, and now the 21st century is exactly what you just mentioned, is that there are many people who insist that there is something solid that is called Islam, and it's a one thing, and everybody has to follow it. That's exactly the problem. So when the Salafists or the Muslim Brotherhood do that, they say this is Islam, nothing else is Islam. What we say is Islam, and this has to be this. If you're going to be a Muslim, this is exactly what you have to follow. And I think this is actually the main problem of all of Islamic civilization, as I said, in the last 2 centuries, is that there is no clear trend to accept the fact that maybe there are multiple Islams. There are different Islams. There are different ways of being Muslim, and people have different ways to be Muslim. And this ties to the issue of identity politics that maybe we'll have time to talk about later, is that there are people who've been manipulating Muslims for over 100 years. Oh, you want to be a Muslim? Do you think you're a Muslim? You have to follow me. You have to fight with me. You have to fight for my cause. That's what being Muslim means. And this manipulation of people's most intimate feelings about God, about who they are, about their identity. I mean, we're born in this world. We don't know what we are. And people come and try to manipulate the only answer that you may have in order to co-opt you in political games that they have and games of power. And this, unfortunately, what's been happening to the Muslim world. So whether the Salafists or the jihadists or the Muslim Brotherhood, that's exactly what they've been doing. They've been telling people there's only one Islam, and it looks like this. And if you want to be a Muslim, you have to do this. And that Islam includes hating Jews, hating Israel, and thinking Islam solely in terms of power. You will never find people of the Muslim Brotherhood or Islamists talking about the decline of Islamic culture as the decline of Islamic arts or the decline of Islamic literature. They will never, it's always power. And that's exactly the problem. So thank you for saying this.
So jihad and martyrdom are very much a part of this branch, this facet, manifestation of Islam. I mean, how do they justify, you talk about blowing up an arena where you're going to have innocent women, children, people going to a pop concert. We're just in the middle of the inquiry at the moment into the Manchester arena bombing. I mean, how does this find itself justified in Islam?
So let me take this a little back further, because a lot of people are not aware of truly, jihad, what jihad is. Even a lot of Muslims, they have no idea. So if we think of Islam as a religion and think of religion not as a Christian concept of religion, I think all of us now, as we're speaking in English, when we think of religion, we're inclined to think in a Christian paradigm of the language that we speak of. A religion is a much more bigger experience than just a relationship between you and God. It includes education, it includes social institutions, and so on. And Islam is like that. It's even bigger. It was a whole civilization, and part of it, of course, was a war ethic. Any civilization had armies, it had wars, it had regulations, it had a war ethic. So jihad, in that sense, is not different. A jihadist 1,000 years ago, I'm not talking about jihadists today, was basically like the samurai. It was like the warrior culture of Islamic civilization. Actually, in Egypt in the 19th century, this is 100% accurate information, the Ministry of Defense, or the Department of War, was called Diwan Jihadiyya, which means the Department of Jihad. So you had this jihad tradition that was the warrior tradition, normally in modern times was about to being transformed into modern ministries of defense, modern, warcraft, and so on and so forth. But what happened is that there are certain intellectual movements that actually maintain that jihad it's actually against the state that refuses to wage it against the infidels. And they changed the concept. They didn't change the concept of jihad, but they kept it from being modernized into what modern warcraft and arts of war are. And then now you have those groups who are saying, no, you can engage in a jihad without the state. You don't need the state to engage in a jihad. You can engage with a jihad on your own against the infidels. And because the infidels are much stronger, now you start having fatwas saying, well, we don't have F-16s, we don't have F-22s, we have our bodies. So it's permissible to go wage jihad with our bodies because we don't have the modern weapons. So you definitely had a lot of Muslim intellectuals, actual intellectuals, rationalizing this and creating what we know today as the jihadist culture,
and the killing of the innocent.
They will rationalize that too. So in the case of Israel, they will say, well, all of them are soldiers or potential soldiers. So they are not innocent. So they deserve to. They will 100% find, ways to rationalize what they want to do.
It's funny you talked about English idiom before, because at school, to begin with, you were not the strongest English student. You weren't the greatest, you weren't thought of as the greatest intellect by the teachers. You were definitely coming across with strong intellectual background and analysis now. But you actually started learning English better, and Hebrew particularly, in order to attack the Jews.
Yeah, definitely. Listen, passions, man's passion is a better drive for anything than an actual reasonable reason. I mean, I sat in school in all those English classes to learn English, and they failed. And once I thought that I'm going to learn English online in Hebrew to fight the Jews better, I became excellent at it. And maybe that also gives us an insight into propaganda, that maybe propaganda and using people's sentiments and mobilizing their emotions and passions is in many ways much more efficient in mobilizing masses to achieve things than actually trying to appeal to them rationally. So I think maybe also that story has an insight into, human behavior.
Tell us about how you got your first Bible.
It's a crazy story. Of course, I grew up in a Muslim family. We didn't even know we know that there are things called Bibles. We didn't even have an idea what they looked like. But when I was obsessed with Jews and Christians, and I wanted to learn about them. So for me, and we all as humans, we do this, we mirror ourselves into others. So for me, I thought, the Quran is everything to me. I do everything according to the Quran. I'm sure Christians and Jews do everything according to the Bible. So if I want to understand them, I have to read the Bible. I was at the time 14. So I decided that I'm going to go to the Christian part of town, which was actually pretty far, and try to buy a Bible from there. And I organized this secret mission in my head, in which I tried to find a way to get to the store. First I went to just a normal store in our street where I knew the shopkeeper is Christian, and I asked him, like, can you help me to get a Bible? He was terrified because a Muslim child asking him how to get a Bible. It can end with an actual lynch in Egypt. Like, for example, if he handed me a Bible and my parents found out, my parents could say, "Oh my God, he's trying to Christianize our child," and this could end up. I'm not kidding. It could. These things unfortunately happen all the time. So he just told me where they sold it, but he wanted nothing to do with me. So I went to that journey across town, and it was actually in a Muslim festival. I waited for the Eid, which is the Islamic holiday, because then I have the money from my father. It's like, I think Hanukkah, Jews give money. So yeah, I took the money and I went and I bought the Bible. And I went back home, and it was just like I was hiding it in the bag all the way home. I was afraid it's going to fall. People are going to discover that I have a Bible. And it was a great experience. And it really changed a lot about how I see the world.
What was your reaction when you started reading Christian literature?
It was definitely a shock. Christian literature. I remember, just shuffling through it, and then the Old Testament, and I don't know what that is, and weird names and weird lands. It just was really difficult. But then the New Testament was easier, and they didn't even know the distinction. What does that mean? What is this and what is that? And I remember started reading some of the Christian teachings, and it was absolutely shocking because it was unlike anything else that I heard at mosque. Because I used to go to a Salafist mosques, and Salafists are very much about power. And there's a saying that they like to say all the time that is, المؤمن القوي خير وأحب عند الله من المؤمن الضعيف, which means that God loves the strong believer over a weak believer. And here the word strength is taken literally in material terms, that you need to be strong. God loves the strong more than he loves the weak. And that was the opposite of what Jesus was saying. Jesus was blessing the meek. He was actually blessing those who are weak and who are poor. And that absolutely shocked me. It was like a big slap on my face. And that was the first time that I start to understand that something is not right.
And then you go online.
And then I go online and I start paying closer attention to everything about Israel, about Jews, about Christians. And I was in denial for a good 2 or 3 years. I was suppressing everything that I'm learning. I was learning those things, but tell myself, this can't be true. This can't possibly be true. This is all a lie. But eventually I couldn't suppress it forever, and it broke out. And I realized the truth, that I am from a very underdeveloped country with severe problems in education. And that causes significant problems in the mainstream culture that let things like ignorance, hatred, anti-Semitism to grow and fester unchecked. And that I live in a state that is quite incompetent in those things. They don't know what to do. And because they want to maintain power, they would rather, flirt with those tendencies and actually try to stop them. And I realized that basically I'm sitting on the top of a disaster and nobody's doing anything about it. And it was a hard realization for a teenager to realize that.
Right. You go on to study and study Hebrew. And you visit the Israeli Academic Center in Cairo, which is sort of this surreal enclave of Sadat's vision still existing in the middle of everything else.
Right. It doesn't exist anymore, by the way.
Oh, really? It's totally gone now, right?
Yeah. After the Arab Spring, it's gone.
So you visit it, and then you're interrogated on the way out.
Yeah, right on the way out. Like I went in. And it was a small apartment with nothing but like bookshelves, and there was nobody there but really one Israeli guard when I got there the first time, which is still, he was the first Jew, the first Israeli I ever meet in my life. And I was ecstatic that I got to actually meet a Jew and Israeli in the flesh. I was very happy. He let me take books, he let me copy, he had a copying machine and copied stuff. I was very happy. And as I stepped out of the building, I get stopped by Egyptian state security, the equivalent of FBI or NSA. And they start asking me about what I'm taking with me, what I'm reading, if I met any Jews up there. And that was the first ever confrontation that I have with authority, or that somebody actually knows about me or knows about what I'm doing. Prior to that moment, I was a completely alone nerd who just learned stuff on his own, and I never really talked to anybody about what I believe. But actually, that visit to the Israeli Academic Center is what brought me to the government's radar.
And how did your parents react when you started manifesting these outrageous sympathies?
My parents did not know. My parents knew in the most terrible way possible, which is state security coming and knocking at our door and taking me and my father to their interrogation center. That's how my family actually found out about how I feel or what I think about things. And I think it was an absolute shock. I don't think that my family ever imagined something like this. He always imagined that. I remember my father telling me that he always felt if the family was ever gonna have trouble, it's gonna be my older brother, who was becoming very religious in a disconcerting way. So they were afraid that the government will start worrying about him becoming a jihadist. And they absolutely had no clue about anything that I do. And I remember my family being completely shocked. They were very incredulous. I remember in the intervention that they did, and they asked me about how I feel about this, how I believe about that. And when I came forward about, how I feel about Christians, how I feel about Israel, how I feel about women, I remember the issue of women specifically for my father was shocking. And this has to do, by the end of the day, issues of gender and sexuality is really one of the deepest things. I actually met an Arab gay man in Washington, D.C. a few weeks ago. And we were sitting together, and then we had to ask the question, what's worse, like what I did to my parents or what I did to your parents, which is coming out as gay. And we both thought about it, and then we decided what he did is actually worse. That coming out as gay would be even worse than being an Israeli quote unquote spy. So anyways, the issues of my views on women, I remember the fact that I don't see myself as the ultimate guardian on my sister, on my mother, and their honor. I remember that disturbing my father a lot. But anyways, that ended it with everything else. That ended my relationship with my parents.
Did that ever recover? Are you in touch with your parents now?
With my mother, finally, thank God. Last year we started talking on the phone, and it's been getting better, and I'm very glad that we're able. Enough time had passed for us to be able to bridge a lot of those gaps. And though that we don't talk about a lot of the issues, we have an opportunity to rebuild our relationship as a mother and a son. And ironically, in a weird way, that the progress that the state of Israel does in its diplomatic relationships with Arab countries actually benefits me in my personal life. After Israel started to signing the deals with the UAE, with Bahrain, and in the Arab media, they openly talk, it's happening. Saudi Arabia is going to have peace with Israel soon. That actually made my mom start telling me on the phone, Hussein, maybe you were right. Maybe we were wrong about this. So,
Oh, really?
So the success of the state of Israel, and that's one other reason that I'm so much attached to Israel. The success of Israel helps me personally in front of my family, in front of my community who think that I'm a traitor, and shows them that I'm not a traitor. Like, it was not a Jewish agenda that I was trying to advance. It was an Arab agenda.
All of this came out of your desire to be the best person you could. The education was in order to find out how to be the best destroyer of Israel. And through that, you learned Hebrew, you learned more English, you made connections. You ended up in prison and tortured. You are somebody who is emerging as an intellectual and something of a liberal, and you're being brutalized by people who come from the country who are just spewing hate. I, just, how do you cope with this imbalance of power between the brutes and the sane?
That was not easy. That was the biggest question. I mean, it remains probably going to remain to be the biggest question. And it was a question, as in the book, I also discuss the my struggling with depression. And it was exactly because of that. It was exactly because, feeling that no matter how much good you want to do, it's just the balance of power is not on your side. It's always the bad always wins. The bad always crushes the good. And it was very, very devastating to me, personally. Even after I left, even after I came to America, it was absolutely crushing internally, psychologically, and mentally, to believe that there's so much bad that it just keeps winning. And when I was struggling with depression, I have to say, what helped me with that question, what helped me with coping with that imbalance of power, was actually the Tanakh. I started reading the Tanakh, and then I discovered it wasn't just me. It wasn't just me who was complaining about, why does this happen to me? Oh God, why is this so terrible? I read the Tanakh, and then I find out that already thousands of years ago, the Jews wrote, Lama derech rashaim tzalecha. Why do the ways of the wicked always triumph? And that was despite the fact that I read the Bible before, but reading it in that light is completely transformed me. That despite the fact that the Bible doesn't even give you an answer, the Tanakh doesn't really give you an answer. It leaves you with more questions than answers. But the fact that knowing that, it's not just you, it's always been like this. We don't know the story of Job, all the questions in the Psalms, Kohelet in Ecclesiastes, vanity, vanity. And then I realized, it's a question that we have. And I would rather just work with the question than just give up. And this is actually one of the best things that helped me to deal with that issue specifically, and with the depression that came with it. And this is why that I continue to do what I'm doing, because there is a question. I don't know why, the bad are winning, but okay, I'm just gonna keep trying to make them not win. And I'm very hopeful. I'm very hopeful that things will get better for Israelis, for Jews, for Arabs, and then they will get worse again because of other things at one point. But that's how it is.
Would you describe yourself as a religious person now?
In one sense, yes. I think I love religion. I believe in God. I was an atheist. I became, as part of the nihilism that came out with me in prison. And I have to tell you, a prison in a country like Egypt, a military prison, with the charges of being a Zionist and the Mossad agent and the traitor, it's a horrific experience. And it's just a deep pit of agony and just hopelessness. So out of that prison cell came with me a lot of nihilism. But I'm glad to say that I found my senses back again. I believe in God, and I believe in goodness. I believe in the benevolence of the world that we see in every morning. And I find myself, yes, I'm religious, but not in the way that a lot of people think about religion, specifically in the Middle East.
Right. I have a question coming through from Irene, who's hopefully can unmute herself. Irene, are you able to unmute yourself? Is there a... Let me...
Sorry,
That's it.
I must have put one. I didn't have a question.
You didn't have a question. You had your hand up.
I have a comment. I think that this young man is a real leader. And are there other people who think in the same way as he does? Does he have friends who think in the same way?
Thank you. There are, but I think there must be more. There are a few who are able to talk about those things openly. You have to understand, the price is beyond high. I mean, I was lucky to be able to get out of Egypt, and I lost everything else. Like, thank God, I'm now regaining my connection with the family, but the price is unimaginably high. So there are other people. I receive messages and emails every day from young people who told me, oh my God, we can't believe we found someone who feels the same way, who thinks the same way. But a lot of them, I actually don't suggest, like many of them, when they send me emails, I tell them to lay low, don't say don't confront anybody, don't challenge anybody, because I'm just afraid of their safety. But the number is growing. And I think the shift that we're seeing from specifically the UAE, and believe it or not, Saudi Arabia, if you had asked me about Saudi Arabia 10 years ago, I would have told you it's the kingdom of evil. Today, it's just unbelievable. I mean, they are actually putting effort and money in de-radicalizing what they have radicalized, but yet it's still a very good effort. So things are definitely changing. There are more young people. The country on which you're from, a lot depends on it. For example, if there's somebody like me in the UAE, they are going to be mostly fine. The worst thing that they can happen, maybe they're going to have trouble in finding employment. But let's say in Egypt, it's still very difficult.
America, elections now. What does it feel like to be in Washington?
It feels unreal. It feels like, oh my God, the Middle East is finally coming together and America is falling apart. It's not an easy time being in America. It's very unfortunate. The polarization is actually tearing this country apart. And I love America. America gave me a home. America gave me a second opportunity. So I hope that America can recover from the current divide in which it's living. I don't know what's going to happen on November 3rd and on Elections Day, but I don't care about November 3rd. I care about after November 3rd, whether it's going to be Biden or Trump. I want Americans to be able to come together, back together behind their country. There are a lot of disturbing things that I'm seeing, things that remind me of the way that I grew up, that are definitely, and I have to tell you all of this as Westerners, I can clearly see rising, disturbing phenomena that reminds me exactly of bad things in the Middle East. The first and foremost is identity politics. Identity, I love identity. I love spending my life trying to understand what does it mean to be an Arab. I love talking to Jews about who they are and about what I learned from their cultural identity. I love identity. But the worst thing that can ever happen to identity is to make it about power. And that's exactly what's been going on in the Middle East for a very long time, making everything about power. Being Muslim is about power, being Arab is about power, being a Christian is about power, being a Jew about power. And your identity determines your place from power and your proximity from power. The liberal Western tradition rose on the premise that identity and power should be separated, and just the civil rights movements and so on. All of them aimed at this: is to make identity irrelevant to politics, identity irrelevant to power. Identity matters to us. It matters to us in our churches and synagogues. It matters to us as our museums, as our heritage, as our culture, maybe as in our education. But it should not matter to politics. And unfortunately, I'm seeing this Middle Eastern bad practice is actually happening here. That if there are people, and I heard this, that are making commercials in TV saying, if you vote like this, you are not really Black. That is terrible. The identity of people should not be tied to power and politics at all. And this is what's going on. You should vote like this if you're white. You should vote like this if you're Jewish. If you should vote like this if you're Black. Is a terrible, terrible practice. It's one of the main reasons that the Middle East is so violent. I'm very, very worried seeing it happening in America. I don't know how it is in Europe. Did it arrive there or not yet? But I hope that the world can recover from this.
So Jeremy's got a question which touches on sort of pride and identity.
Yeah, thank you, Rabbi. Why do you think that the Islamic world, which was so much ahead of the West in the Middle Ages in terms of mathematics, culture, medicine, science, astrology? What are those sort of areas, if you know, right up to the 1600s, you'd have said the Islamic world was ahead of the West. Why has it fallen so far behind and doesn't seem to have any way of renewing itself in those sort of contexts?
Well, you definitely asked the question. For the past 200 years, any Muslim intellectuals that took themselves seriously, that was the question that they spent their entire life trying to solve. What happened? Why are we in retreat? It's Bernard Lewis dedicated a book especially to that question. It's called What Went Wrong, which is exactly that question. And it's a very, very difficult question. I wish I had an answer, but that's exactly the problem. That in the Muslim world, they have no answer. They are very aware of their decline. It's actually part of the neurotic. It's why they have so much neurotic tendencies. It's because they are aware of this inferiority and created an inferiority complex that is really hard to deal with. But there are many proposed answers that I can tell you 100% all of them are wrong. So the main answer was provided by the early ideological cultural revival movement, was that tied the decline specifically to power. He said decline is because of the loss of power. If we are to rise again, we have to regain power. And the all of Islamism grew out of that assumption. So basically it focused only on the issue of power and to try to regain power. Another answer is unity, that basically the division is, so all of them were political answers, but till now, I don't think there is a real attempt to answer that question. If I have to take my own attempt at it, I think it has to do with a failure of the intellectual elite of the Muslim world at a certain period of time that is hard to pin down, maybe the 13th century. And they ended up closing the Muslim mind. And that's what actually needs a reform, is the logic itself. So we think about reason as something universal that all humans have. I don't think that's true. I think reason is universal, but we all have different kinds of reason constructed differently by the cultural paradigms and constructions that we come from. So I think there is something called the Jewish mind, there's something called the Western mind, and there's something called maybe the Muslim or Arab mind. We don't even know when does that end, when does that begin. It's one of the problems. And I think that Muslim/Arab mind it needs a reform. The logic that it was built into it has some serious flaws. And I think this is why it keeps reaching wrong answers about many questions. The problem is the logic itself. So for example, Immanuel Kant, he wrote his most famous book, Critique of Pure Reason. I think it's a critique of Western reason. I love that book. I love his work. I'm still struggling to understand Kantian philosophy, but that's a Western reason. I can attest that the Middle East has very different apparatus that's operating with a different reason, and that's exactly what needs an update or a reformation. And it's a difficult process. It's not easy. And again, I'm afraid that this might be. I really don't mean. I don't know. I'm afraid that I'm starting to see worrying instance in Western civilization that also reminds me of this. Actually, sometimes I watch America and Europe and try to figure out, I'm not kidding, is this what happened to Muslims 8 centuries ago? Making everything about power, the inability to be critical of yourself, inability to be original or creative, the idea that we reach the ultimate understanding in certain things that we can never pass, this is it. Francis Fukuyama wrote his famous book, The End of History, in the early 90s, about that the liberal world order, which I love, is just the ultimate world order, and humanity will never surpass the beauty and the glory of that. I wonder if this is what happened in the 13th century to Muslims, thinking that their world order of the 13th century was just the ultimate highest end, that nothing else could be bettered in it. So I don't know what happened, but I'm trying to share what I think.
I just want everybody to pause for a moment, because we're listening to somebody discussing Kant and Fukuyama and the end of history. In 8 years ago, you leave Egypt with $700 that has been given to you by Coptic friends who are helping you sort of smuggle you out of the country. You live under you live under the shelter of the Coptic church until you realize you can't keep doing that, and you are sleeping on the streets in America. All right, this is 10 years ago, 8 years ago, you're doing that. And since then, you have mastered the languages of English and Hebrew. You have become an American citizen. You were teaching Hebrew to the American military, which is just quite a phenomenal achievement. And I can only imagine that's because the Israelis don't speak it well enough or don't have enough patience to teach it properly. But this transition, we're sitting listening to you sharing this story and this wisdom that just could have been lost in a backwater of Cairo, or could have exploded itself in some kind of foolish adventure. I just wanted people to take a moment and reflect on what we're listening to and how. What did it feel like to go to Israel for the first time?
Thank you. That's very kind of you. Going to Israel was absolutely amazing. I just went to Israel the first time in 2018, and that was, it was very weird to be for the first time ever in a country that changed my life so profoundly. It's just unbelievable. Also, a country that spoke the language fluently. So here I am landing in Israel after my life has been completely transformed. I speak Hebrew fluently, but it's the first time being there. And I remember talking to people on the street and nobody believing me at all about where I'm from, or that this was my first time in Israel. I remember even that I was in a Roma coffee shop for the first time, and then I ordered coffee. And then after I said coffee and he started making it, I remembered that coffee doesn't mean the same thing in every country. Like if you say coffee in Egypt, you'll get like a small Turkish coffee. If you say coffee in America, you get. So I stopped them. It's like, hey, wait. What? And they said in Hebrew, of course, in perfect Hebrew, like, what are you making? And he said, he looked at me weird. It's like, I'm making coffee. What coffee? I was like, yeah, how are you? I don't know exactly what. Tell me what you're making. And he looked at me as if I was insane. And it's like, what do you want from me? You said coffee, I'm making you coffee. And I had these experiences over and over, so it was great. But I think the feeling, with all the happiness and the joy of being in Israel, I think there was also some pain or so a little sadness, that this is what the Middle East should have been. That Israel, it's exactly what Arab countries where I came from should be. It's an authentic Middle Eastern country that has the religion. They didn't become atheist, Swedish, a Swedish town. They are Middle Eastern. Israelis are religious. Israelis, they do have the authentic Middle Eastern civilization, the culture, the food, everything. But yet it's modernized, and they do try to live a life that preserves human dignity, that preserves human liberty. And I was walking to Lviv, and Tel Aviv looks a lot like Alexandria, but much cleaner and with freedom. And I felt like I wish that more Arabs could see this, more Arabs could see what they could be. Arabs, with Jeremy's question, the question about decline, as I said, they are very aware of their decline, and it makes them quite neurotic. And you will find them completely focused on the West. Islamic scholars go and learn also English and French and German, so they can become Islamic scholars. They are very focused on trying to become like the West or competing with the West. but they don't need that. They don't understand the beauty that they have. They don't understand the beauty that their own culture have. And I wish that they could see Israel in order to learn from Israel what they could be. And after those peace deals, knowing that, just I think 2 days ago, United Arab Emirates and Israel signed the visa exemption treaty. That means that citizens won't even need a visa to travel from the UAE and Israel. I'm very happy and I'm very excited that Arabs will finally get to walk down the street in Tel Aviv. And the Emiratis, who are wonderful people, they will understand, you know what, we don't have to try to become the West. We don't have to try to make Dubai a big shopping mall like in the ones in America. We actually can make it something authentic and beautiful and clean and modern and progressive.
So I've got a message here in the chat from Loretta and Perry Cash, who say, please say hi to Hussein. We were with him in Jerusalem with Stand With Us delegation. I remember how emotional he was. And I think there's a sort of evangelical side to your presentation. You're somebody who is really passionate. It's led you into trouble and into torture and into exile and into education. And that's what you're doing now. What is the message, Hussein, that you would like to share with us?
Well, the message is definitely education, and not just as a slogan, but and there's something that Jews have known for a very, very, very long time. I think the Jewish culture, one of the things I tell non-Jews, by the way, for non-Jews, I'm really annoying. I talk about Jews in Israel all the time, in a good way, not in a fetishized way, but I just want to pass a lot of the lessons that I've learned. And as far as I know, the Jewish culture, one of the world's most ancient culture, is the only culture of the world that a male's, and now it's male and female, but primarily originally males' rite of passage into manhood is done through learning how to read. This is absolutely monumental. All other cultures, the rite of passages, one way or the other, included violence. They included fights. They included young men trying to do like tough things, jumping on fire, slaughtering a sheep in order to prove their manhood. And here you have this culture of, nerds that their rite of passage is through learning how to read. This is just a huge realization. And I think the entire world and the Jews above everybody else will always be indebted to your Jewish ancestors for this realization, the importance of reading, the importance of learning, the importance of education. So this is the only possible way that we can move forward, that we can advance people. The reason that there's so much anti-Semitism in the Middle East, the reason that I wanted to kill Jews and hated Jews when I was little, was not because I was being evil. It was not because that I was a malevolent demon that wanted to destroy all the good and wanted to tear Jewish babies to pieces because I'm a Count Dracula. It's because I was ignorant. I was very, very, very ignorant, and I thought I knew the truth, and I was living in a fairy tale. I was living in a Lord of the Rings fantasy where I was little Frodo who has to go and destroy Lord Sauron in Middle Earth. And this is what I thought reality was. And the only way that we can fix this is through education. And it's the problem that exists everywhere. I mean, Plato wrote about this, 600 BC, Plato's cave, all the people sitting in the dark cave and, and you trying to educate people, that the word education comes from the Greek thing, edukrit, which means to lead out. And this is what we need to do to people, is try to lead them out of darkness, to lead them out to knowledge. It's the same problem that exists in the Middle East, that exists in Western Europe, that exists in North America, that exists wherever human beings live. It's a problem of knowledge. It's a problem of education. And Jews are amazing at it, half of the world's population, half of humanity follows a Jewish religion, whether Christianity or Islam. Most of humanity gives names of their children such as Abraham, Jacob, Sarah. Those are Jewish names. It's because of that realization of tradition of education. So it's definitely possible. Jews transformed the world before. You can transform the world now. And you don't need protocols of Zion, of course, and conspiracies for that. It's only can be done through education and the power of education. This is why I work with Stand With Us, and this is why I'm here today, because I know that you listening to my story or reading my book, you will maybe learn one thing about, you know, another people that you don't know much about, that they are people and their problems are very human. And I believe that there is a future for Israel and the Arab world, and it's a future of cooperation. And I believe that we're going there. So thank you very much for all your question, Rabbi, and thank you everybody for listening to me, and thank you of course for Sarah for helping to organize this event. If I can plug in, just on November 23rd, Stand With Us UK is going to have its gala. I encourage all of you to attend. And there is another wonderful speaker, Majid Nawaz. He's much older than I am, but he's definitely no less interesting. I would say he's even more interesting, a former Islamist.
So just before I hand over to Sarah, thank you very much, Hussein. We can watch the film and a video, and it gives us a story of someone who was beaten so badly that they're standing up to fight for Israel. But if you have the conversation that we've just had, or if you read the book, which has so much more texture and depth, it takes us from sort of the Hasbara films that we grew up with into the Hasbara and philosophy that is necessary to fight for Israel and to counter anti-Semitism in 2021 and in the 21st century. It brings it very much into the present. That couldn't have happened this evening without the approach from Stand With Us UK. And I'd like to thank our anonymous sponsor for funding this evening's activity and conversation, for which we're really, really grateful, but not to diminish the need to support Stand With Us and the work that they are doing. And I'd like to hand over to Sarah to say some words of closure and to remind you about the gala dinner, which is not a dinner, on the 23rd of November. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Lawrence. And I'm really sorry for what happened earlier. I have no idea. I just couldn't unmute myself at all. But actually, I just have to say something really funny. I said to Hussein earlier today to send me through his bio so that I could introduce him in the way he would want to be introduced. And I need to say this because it doesn't do it justice. Hussein said that he was, as a child, a self-described reclusive internet nerd, obsessed with comic books and the like. Now, the person we've just heard couldn't be further from that child. Someone that can talk about philosophers and the Tanakh and the Bible and religion and has such huge insight. You have come so far. And when I have this little nugget of information about you, it doesn't represent who you are at all. It represents where you've come from. And actually, it's remarkable. And I've heard you speak a number of times before, and I feel privileged on every occasion. And I'm privileged to work with you at Stand With Us. And I'm very grateful for Rabbi Lawrence for inviting us to come along this evening and for giving us the opportunity to bring Hussein to you. But mostly I'm grateful to Hussein for giving us so much time this evening and for enlightening everybody and me once again. And all I can say is please join us, as Rabbi Lawrence and Hussein has said, and please watch our gala on the 23rd of November and hear more about what Stand With Us can do and our wonderful educators, of which Hussein is definitely one of our most honoured educators in the organisation. But we have some wonderful people and we're here to educate about Israel and anti-Semitism. So please join us, and thank you everybody, and thank you Hussein. Thank you.
So thanks very much, Sarah. And just a reminder also that on Monday, the 1st of November, I will be in conversation with Philippe Sands at 8 o'clock. And please do join us for that as well. Wish everybody a good evening and please stay safe. Thank you.